Good morning and salam sejahtera to all lecturers and my fellow friends. I am Putri Aina Sufia with metric number A212895. Today, I will be presenting about the research regarding microplastic pollution in deep sea sediments from the Great Australian Bight. This research was carried out by Justin Barrett and colleagues from CSIRO and the University of Tasmania. Let me ask you one question. Do you know that even in the deepest part of the ocean, there can still be a plastic waste hidden in the mud? Yes, even in places where humans rarely go, microplastics have already reached the deep sea. So, plastic pollution is one of the biggest environmental problems in the ocean today. Over time, plastic breaks down into a very small pieces called microplastics. Microplastics are very tiny pieces of plastics which are smaller than 5 millimeter. They come from a bigger plastic things like bottles, bags, and fishing gear that break into smaller pieces. These tiny plastics can travel long distance through ocean currents and eventually sink to the deep ocean floor. However, researchers still do not fully understand how much microplastic exists in the deep sea environments. The main objective of this study are to measure how much microplastics is found in the deep sea sediments and to assess whether deep sea sediments act as a measure sink for marine plastic pollution. Now let's move to methods. The first step in this research is that the researcher collected sediment samples from 6 deep sea locations in the Great Australian Bight. These sampling sites were located at depth ranging at 1,655 to 3,062 meters below sea level. In figure 1, I put the brown dot to show the 6 sampling locations where sediment samples were collected. Next, the researcher used a remotely operated vehicle, also known as ROV, to collect sediment cores directly from the seafloor. For number 3, the sediment samples were brought to the laboratory where they were processed using density separation with a zinc chloride solution to separate the microplastic from the sediment. Then, the researcher used Nile red fluorescence staining, which makes microplastic visible under a microscope, and microscopy was used to identify and count the microplastic particles. For number 4, selected samples were verified using OPTIR spectroscopy, which is a very advanced machine, and it used to identify what a tiny material is made of. Especially very small particles like microplastics, which to confirm that the particles were truly plastics. Move to number 5 as the final step. Statistical analysis using GAM models was carried out to study the relationship between microplastics and environmental factors. Moving along to results, as you can see, the first results shows microplastic abundance in the deep sea sediments, which microplastics were found in all sampling sites with values ranging from 0 to 13.6 particles per gram of dry sediment. The average amount was about 1.26 particles per gram. So, why it looks like this? Okay, it is because the values are low in some places, which is 0, because not all deep sea areas have the same pollution input, and some locations have a higher values because more plastic settles there due to ocean movement and seafloor condition. The second result is spatial variation, which means how microplastics are distributed across different locations. Also, the study shows that microplastics level are not the same even within the same site. This actually happened because of some sediment cores are close together but still show different values, and ocean currents move plastics unevenly. Other than that, the seafloor is not flat and uniform, so plastic accumulates in patches instead of evenly. The third result shows the key environmental factors that influence microplastics accumulation in deep sea sediments. The study found that microplastics levels are positively related to surface plastics concentration and seaflow slope. This means that areas with more plastics floating on the ocean surface tend to have more plastics in the sediment below. In addition, steeper seafloor areas tend to collect more microplastics. However, there was no strong relationship between microplastics levels and the ocean depth, distance from the coastlines, or shipping activity. Now, the fourth result is the global estimate of microplastics accumulation in deep sea sediments. This study estimates that millions of tons of microplastics may exist on the global seafloor. The estimate was calculated based on the observed data from the sampling sites and then scaled up to represent the global ocean. This shows that deep sea sediment is a major long-term sink for microplastics pollution. Now, let's look at Figure 2. Figure 2 shows that the distribution of microplastics concentrations across different sediment cores using a box plot. Each box represents one sampling location in the deep sea area. It shows that there is a large variation in microplastics levels even within the same sampling site. As you can see here, there are more than 10 sediment cores because multiple samples were collected from different points to make the results more accurate and to show the variation in microplastics distribution. Some sediment contain very low or zero microplastics, while others contain much higher amounts. This shows that microplastics are not evenly distributed on the seafloor. Instead, the pollution is patchy even between nearby locations. The x-axis in the graph represents the number of microplastics particles per gram of dry sediment. This means it shows how many microplastic pieces are found in 1 gram of seafloor mud. A value of 0 means no microplastics were found in that sample, while higher values indicate more contamination. For example, a value of 13.6 means that there are 13.6 microplastic particles in 1 gram of sediment. Therefore, the higher the y-axis value, the higher the level of microplastics pollution in that sample. For discussion, it shows that deep sea sediments contain measurable and widespread microplastics contamination. This means that microplastics are not only found near the surface or coastal areas, but have also reached the deep ocean environment. The study also found that microplastics are distributed very unevenly. Even samples taken from a small spatial distance can have different amounts of microplastics. It shows that microplastic pollution in the deep sea is highly variable and not spread equally. Another important finding is that surface plastic pollution strongly influences deep sea deposition. When there is more plastic pollution on the ocean surface, more microplastics may eventually sink and settle on the seafloor. In addition, the shape of the seafloor also plays an important role. Areas with steeper seafloor slopes can affect how microplastics move and accumulate in the deep sea sediment. Overall, the deep ocean acts as a long-term sink for marine plastic waste. Once microplastics reach the seafloor, they may have remained there for a long time. These findings suggest that global plastic pollution is more extensive than previously estimated. In conclusion, microplastics were found in all deep sea sediment samples. This shows that even remote ocean environments are affected by plastic pollution. The distribution is uneven and depends on environmental factors. Overall, this study highlights the importance of reducing plastic waste to protect the ocean. The below were the acknowledgement researchers and the reference used by the researchers to complete this research.